So welcome back, everyone, to the second part of our second day. We had already a very good start to the second day. Very interesting presentations from Dr. Komiyama and Mr. Ho, who really, what I retained, many pieces of useful information, but some of the key messages that resonated with me is this emphasis that was put by both speakers on the need really to develop international law on cybersecurity, and that there's a need for individual states, but the international community together to work and better define the rules and norms around cyber conflict. And then also this importance of trust among stakeholders in a way to, first of all, to avoid conflict, but also for cybersecurity, or for example, incident response to work better. So these two issues we will pick up again now in the second half of the day, and I'm very delighted to welcome two speakers to our round. So we have Mr. Benjamin Charlier from the International Committee of the Red Cross, who joins us here from Geneva. He's a legal advisor at the Icrc, specializing in the issues around cyber conflict. And then Mr. Miguel Alberto Gomez, who is a researcher currently working on his PhD and working at the ETH Zürich, amongst one of these many engagements. So at first, in the session, we will also look again at these two aspects, on the national and the international aspects of rule of law in cybersecurity. Mr. Charlier will start now the session. We heard quite a bit now already in the first part of the session about both the rules of or the developing kind of questions and developing norms around the justifications for reasons for war or for preventing it. So what is called in legal terms jus ad bellum. Now from Mr. Charlier, we'll hear much more about the other side, the concept of jus in bello, so international humanitarian law, and what is the law that governs the way warfare is conducted. The Icrc has been very active in this field and has also contributed, for example, to this group of government experts that was mentioned many times already. They've contributed position papers on that, and provided their expertise. So we're very much looking forward now to hear from Mr. Charlier more about the thinking of the Icrc behind IHL in cyber conflict and cyber warfare.
Thank you very much. So first of all, about an audio test. Can everybody hear me nicely and correctly?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I'm very pleased and honored to have been invited to present today on basically what the Icrc sees as the main challenges related to the military use of cyber capabilities, cyber operations, when conducted in the frame of an armed conflict. I have a presentation. I have a PowerPoint support, which I can find. Where is it? Okay, it was supposed to be here. Okay, just give me a second. Yeah, voila. No, that's not this one. I'm sorry. Apologies. It's coming. It's obviously when you actually think you're all set. So that's not this. This is this one. Well, apologies. Voilà. So basically, I'm very pleased to have heard also that you've extensively discussed the concept of use ad bellum, use in bello, and basically basically the difference between the paradigms, because this is something that is very relevant for the discussion that we usually have with states on the challenges linked to cyber operations. I will come back to that. But so basically the first point is, why do you believe that the ICRC as a humanitarian organization is interested in looking into cyber warfare somehow? Well, in a nutshell, the short answer to that is simply because as a humanitarian organization, the ICRC is interested in the potential human cost or the humanitarian consequences of any type of means and methods of warfare, any type of weapons that are being used, and especially when new military capabilities are being developed, precisely because we don't know yet the full humanitarian cost of these weapons. So basically, what the ICRC is interested in following in relation to cyber warfare is based on three pillars. We're interested in better understanding the technology developing behind military capabilities. That's one aspect. We are definitely linking that with, as I said, the humanitarian consequences that the use of these new weapons can entail. And this is, and the more we look into it, the more potential consequences we discover. And finally, obviously, we also want to look at how relevant and adequate is the law of armed conflict in relation to these new weapons. So basically, is a cyber operation, when it's used as a mean of warfare, is it regulated like any other weapon under the rules of the law of armed conflict, or is there a need for further developing the law in order to address some of the challenges? So basically, I have about 20 to 25 minutes to unpack what we believe these main challenges are. Apologies in advance if I tell you things that you are very much aware of. I'm not aware of your level of expertise in either IHL, International Humanitarian Law, or in those related challenges with cyber operations. And we will not have time to go into details, but I hope that it will entail a discussion afterwards. So the starting point basically is that we now know that resorting to cyber warfare has become a reality. I will come back to that, but a number of states have already formally acknowledged that they're developing both offensive and defensive cyber military capabilities. So whether we like it or not, I mean, there's a definite need to address that new thing under the framework of international law. We also know that certain states, although they're relatively reluctant to acknowledge the use, have actually resorted to cyber weapons in the frame during armed conflict, and it's been officially acknowledged by namely Australia or the UK in their fight against the Islamic State group in the past. So it's there. What we're talking about here, just to be clear, is indeed cyber operations that are happening during wartime. So, as you know, international humanitarian law only applies when there's a nexus, a link to a situation of armed conflict, whether the operation triggers that armed conflict or if an armed conflict is already ongoing, then the attack is definitely linked to that situation of armed conflict. We also know that, I mean, most cyber operations are, let's say, criminal in nature, like hacking, and happens in peacetime, basically. And we've seen many examples over the past year and a half during the COVID pandemic of how health infrastructures have been attacked by criminal groups, basically ransomwares, etc. But all this happens in peacetime, and as you probably know, then it's not regulated by the law of armed conflict by definition. It's more regulated by law enforcement paradigm and domestic legislations. So when we're talking about cyber operations during armed conflict, we're definitely talking about cyber operations when they're being used as a weapon, as a mean to wage or to conduct hostilities against an enemy in the context of an armed conflict. I just mentioned that point. Cyber espionage in peacetime is not covered by IHL, nor is cyber crime. Let me now briefly give you an overview of what we've seen as some trends in the development of military use of cyber operations and the key stakes that are related to that. We know that the nature of warfare has evolved over the last decades. And based on what we've seen so far and the discussions that we've had with states, we understand cyber military operations as entailing defense operations. So states are developing capabilities to protect their own infrastructures against cyber attacks. Espionage, target identification, I mean, information operations also to affect the enemy's morale, to disrupt telecommunication and generally communication systems. But more interestingly, we also know that states are developing cyber capabilities in support of their kinetic operations. For instance, the traditional example would be to attack the radar system by way of a cyber operation, so that then you can attack in a more conventional way with warplanes. And then you also have the possibility of launching attacks that can actually have themselves a physical effect. Explosions or affecting, we will talk about that in a minute, but affecting critical infrastructures or potentially releasing dangerous forces as such. So military capabilities are there, they're likely to stay. Cyber operations during armed conflict exist, but also there is a challenge in terms of operationalizing them. I mean, it's still something that needs to be developed by the militaries. What are the SOPs, the standard operation procedures that needs to be applied to that kind of specific non-kinetic and somehow covered, let's say, operations? What type of precautions do you need to take before actually developing and definitely launching such means of warfare? All these need to be taken into account and better understood as technology evolves. And the last point is that one must also realize that it's very true that by way of cyber operations, one can make the argument that you can cause less damage to the civilian population or create less collateral damages than through general kinetic, let's say, attacks. Although this is true, naturally, to be able to contain cyber operations in terms of during wartime and also in peacetime, I mean, you are experts in that field. You know that you know the amount of technical expertise and resources that might be needed. In terms of the potential cost, again, I don't need to go too much into the details here because I'm very sure that you know very much the devastating potential effects of cyber operations. I'm listing here a couple of examples that we've seen so far in war-affected countries and in armed conflict situations, either intentionally or not, because that is really the critical point when you talk about the humanitarian consequences of these type of weapons, that either intentionally you can affect critical infrastructures like power grids, petrochemical plants, obviously nuclear facilities with devastating effects. And if you do that intentionally, obviously, it's prohibited by the law of armed conflict. But you can also affect them unintentionally by not controlling the weapon in itself. So again, we've had an example, and you might be aware of that over the past year in peacetime during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, of a patient in Germany because of these ransomware. Had to be transferred from a hospital to another and ultimately died from the lack of care. So we have like concrete examples now, unfortunately, of in peacetime direct physical consequence of a cyber, in this case, criminal operation. Overall, we see these as three major concerns about cyber operations. Again, this is as a matter of introduction. We're not talking about specific IHL related challenges, but the proliferation of these tools is something that we need to keep in mind. They are there to stay and to be further developed. A risk of overreaction, maybe you've talked about that in the previous sessions, or it's something to consider because of their covered nature and because it's very difficult to actually, for a state, to immediately understand the nature of an attack by way of cyber means against itself. There is definitely a risk of overreaction. You might definitely consider that a state might not want to wait to see what happens if something goes wrong. And so there is a risk of overreaction and retaliation. And then obviously the attribution is a major challenge. I'm sure that you've discussed that already. Again, no need to go into the details about that, but this is something that is very sui generis to this type of new means of warfare. So in relation to the law of armed conflict, the main questions that cyber military operations raise are, it's twofold. It's whether the law of armed conflict as such do apply to these operations, and if so, how? How can you translate the principles of the law of armed conflict, which have been developed in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, so back in 1949 and then in 1977, to a brand new way of waging war? I'm not coming back to that point, which you've discussed. Again, the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols do not touch upon the question of whether or not you're the victim of an aggression by another state, or is the cyber operation in itself legal or licit under international law. This is a matter for the Charter of the United Nations and the prohibition of resorting to armed forces between states. IHL is a very pragmatic set of rules that basically binds every belligerent parties, irrespective of the legality of the war in itself. So once war erupts, all parties are equally bound to respect a number of rules in terms of who must be protected from the hostilities and how hostilities can be conducted. The Geneva Conventions do apply only in situations of armed conflict. Please keep in mind that a situation of armed conflict is a legal term, so it's not just about any skirmishes. It's a legal definition that triggers a specific body of law. There are two, and not three or four or five, also please kindly keep that in mind. There are two types of armed conflicts under the international humanitarian law: international or non-international armed conflicts. International armed conflict is a war between two states, pretty straightforward, and non-international armed conflict are always involved at least one organized armed group, rebels, basically. Why do I mention this? Because it's interesting, and one of the major challenges under the law of armed conflict related to cyber operations is to basically see if the operations that is waged happens, as I said, in the frame of a legally classified armed conflict. Although I wrote here that different views exist on whether international humanitarian law applies as such, as a body of law, to cyber operations in armed conflict, one must honestly say that it's less and less contentious. Everybody mostly agree, except for a couple of countries, that there is no reason to exclude the rules on conduct of hostilities from, or I mean the other way around, cyber operations from the rules on conduct of hostilities. At the end of the day, cyber operations are nothing less than a new way of waging war, but it's a new type of weapon. And so as such, it probably should be regulated. And those countries that actually are refrain from fully acknowledging that the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols apply to cyber operations, somehow also do it based on either a confusion or a reluctance to admit the separation between the jus ad bello and the jus in bellum. Somehow the argument that these countries make is that accepting that the law of armed conflict applies to cyber operations would somehow legitimize the resort to these type of operations between states. Although it is somehow a legitimate argument, again, it comes down to the separation of these body of laws. But I mean, the great majority now applies that, indeed, agrees that it applies. The real questions, and I listed here 4 out of many other type of challenges. How does IHL apply? let me also be very clear for the ICRC, without surprise, as a humanitarian organization and especially specialized in promoting the law of armed conflict, we do believe that IHL applies to cyber operations, and that there is no, as I said, reason to treat cyber operations very differently from any other type of means of waging warfare when the consequences are death, injury, and other devastating consequences for the civilian population. Okay, one of the questions that is being discussed in the international community is the question of whether a cyber operation in itself can trigger an armed conflict. So, as I said, if there is a traditional armed conflict between two states, we believe that cyber military operations that have a nexus with that conflict are governed. Now, can in itself a cyber operation trigger an armed conflict, an international or non-international armed conflict? This is still debated. States have not expressed themselves very clearly on that point. As I said, the ICRC's position is that when you have a cyber attack that causes the same effects as a kinetic one, well, there is no reason to treat that attack differently from a kinetic type of attack. And basically, an international armed conflict is triggered whenever there is a resort to armed forces between two states. So the question is a cyber operation that causes civilian or military casualties a resort to armed force in itself? And more interestingly, what about those operations that simply neutralize a system without causing physical damage? Again, this is something interesting to consider from a legal point of view. It's not being solved as such. Another obviously crucial point is the definition of an attack. What basically characterizes attacks under the law of armed conflict, and can cyber operations fall under that definition? I will not go into the details here, but you can easily understand the implications of that question, basically, because if you don't believe, or if you make the legal argument that cyber military operations do not fall under the definition of an attack, well, then this operation escapes basically from the whole set of rules on the conduct of hostilities and the limitations that are imposed on parties to use these resources. And this obviously can have dramatic consequences. We believe that the right legal view is basically to consider that an attack is an act of violence between the two belligerent parties. And the notion of violence is not obviously linked only to the actual mean that you use, but it's also linked to the consequences of that act. And so it would be absurd, basically, not to consider that a cyber operation that causes dozens of deaths or injuries simply because there is no, as such, a kinetic, let's say, use of a weapon would not be regulated by the law of armed conflict. So basically, the most protective legal view is to consider that indeed attacks that cause death, injury, and other types of physical violence are definitely attack. Then again, the question arises, what about attacks that simply disrupt systems, interconnected electric systems, without actually causing physical damage to the infrastructure or to the civilians themselves. Again, this is something that is being currently debated among states. Another crucial point, and I will soon conclude, just to give you an idea of the challenges. The principle of distinction under the law of armed conflict is the cornerstone. Basically, it says that the only admissible target for the belligerent parties are military objectives. Any attacks by way of kinetic or cyber means against a non-military objective is prohibited and is actually a war crime. So you must always distinguish between the civilian and the military targets. How do you do that in the cyberspace? There is definitely a possibility to design cyber weapons that will be extremely specific in terms of target designation. But you know probably more than me than the risk of also releasing cyber viruses, cyber weapons that can, the consequences of which can spread way beyond the specific target. That's one aspect. If you release a virus and it accomplishes its mission, then what about the blueprints of this virus and their possible repurposing in the future of that cyber weapon out there that you leave? The challenge of dual use objects. As we can imagine, most of cyber, let's say, infrastructure rely on objects that serves both the military but also the civilians, the civilian population. So how can it be legal to attack, disrupt the GPS services, for instance, when you know that it will affect heavily the civilian population also? And another challenge in relation to the application of the law on conflict is definitely the protection of data. I'm not going into the detail, but the question remains, are data as such an object? Because if it is, then most of the data that we're considering in our everyday life are civilian in nature, and therefore, based on what I just explained, they cannot be attacked as such. And one can easily imagine the devastating and possibly very efficient consequences for a state to try to attack and disrupt data from the enemy. You can think of banking systems, you can think of social security databases, etc. I mean, you can bring a country to its knees by basically erasing, tampering with, and attacking those data. So the question remains, is data a physical, it's not a physical, is an object in itself that is protected under the law of armed conflict? And once again, the Icrc certainly believes that it is, because concluding otherwise would lead to some sort of absurd conclusions in terms of the protective framework that the law of armed conflict is designed to provide to civilians. But states have not yet concluded decisively on these on this point and the previous ones. So my conclusion is basically that the law of armed conflict does apply to cyber operation. There is no really doubt that somehow cyber operations during armed conflict do not happen in a legal vacuum, for sure. And there is no doubt that cyber tools, when they're designed, providing that states have the resources to actually design cyber weapons that can be contained, that can be tested, can actually be used in compliance with the law of armed conflict. However, as we've seen, there are still plenty of challenges that need basically to be addressed and somehow tested by the international community. And states have to actually to position themselves on these questions. Because only then, when states have expressed themselves on some of the points that I mentioned today, then we will be able to see if the legal framework is adequate and sufficiently developed to address these situations, or if there is a potential need for developing new sets of rules, binding rules to actually address these issues. You know that cybersecurity is heavily being discussed at the UN level in different forums. We can only regret at this stage that these questions that I mentioned today, related specifically to how international humanitarian law applies to cyber operations, have yet not still been addressed substantively in these forums. So we hope and we invite states to continue expressing their views on these specific points. And obviously, if in your capacities you can participate to that debate, well then it's very much welcome somehow. I put here a couple of resources on this for your reference, which I will definitely share with the organizers. Again, this is specifically related to the law of armed conflict, not international law in general, but these 4 resources clarify a number of points that I mentioned today. And then we didn't have time to discuss it, but I'm sure you're aware of the Tallinn manual. And this website, which is very interesting because it presents the international applicable legal framework to cyber operations by way of scenarios. Some are conflict related, some not. So it's a very engaging way to actually look into international law and cyber operations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very rich and interesting overview. I think it really picked up where we left the last discussion, and especially how you very well set out the different challenges that there are around the application of IHL and the use of cyber weapons in armed conflict. And there's many questions that I would have, but in the interest of time, I would propose that we move on now to the second speaker and then have the questions afterwards to both Mr. Charlie and Mr. Gomez. So for if I might now hand over to Mr. Miguel Alberto Gomez, who will now move to a slightly different remit, kind of leaving now the issues of armed conflict and looking more again into cybersecurity in general at the national level, and how different countries have organized cybersecurity governance, how they have set up systems of different actors working together or not, or what the challenges are around that. So, Mr. Gomez, please take the floor.
Thank you. Let me just set up the slide for this one. All right, then. So thank you for inviting me to give a talk on this session. So based on what I've heard from the last presentation and what the overall structure is, I think my presentation is adequately placed to address this whole concern of reaching a common approach, or at least not a common, at the very least, a compatible approach in dealing with cybersecurity concerns at the national level, specifically with a focus on Asia. And this is particularly interesting in the context of Asia, not only because of the participants who are in this workshop today, but also because of the unique challenges that the region brings. So I will be focusing more on, in the interest of time, I will be focusing more on the challenges when it comes to establishing and collaborating when it comes to cybersecurity rather than individual national solutions. And basically, the talking points will revolve around these 4 key areas. So the challenges of cybersecurity governance around Asia, mostly rotating around the 3 areas that I think we find a lot of difficulty with, particularly when it comes to like interest and threats, capabilities and maturity, and communication and cooperation. I then move on to how to bridge those gaps, mainly through confidence building and capacity building measures. In the sense that the bookstore itself sells books fixed on a particular topic. They all discuss generally the same topic, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all the books agree on specific key issues. And that's how I would describe cybersecurity governance in the context of the Asia Pacific. There's this general consensus that it is an important issue, but the specifics of how we go about managing cybersecurity is particularly diverse, and in certain cases may be incompatible with each other's view. And one of the key reasons why I find that to be the case is if we look at the characteristics of cyberspace and how it is employed or used within the region itself. Since Franziska shared her presentation that she did yesterday, wherein we take this human-centric approach to cybersecurity governance, focusing on the needs of the individual. If we look at it from the Asian context, there is particularly uneven use when it comes to cyberspace and its corresponding components. So society, as per the ITU, if we look at societal infrastructure, societal use, existing infrastructure, and levels of expertise, if we compare, let's say, Northeast Asian countries with Southeast Asian countries, there is a clear difference here. So ITU uses a 1 to 10 rating system. And you'd notice that Northeast Asia significantly rates much higher here than its Southeast Asian counterparts on average. Despite this, however, you do have a general increase in interest with respect to this issue within the region. So over the last 5-10 years, there's been a growth in the development of cybersecurity strategies, national cybersecurity strategies, policies, and organizations within the region as a whole. But this does not necessarily mean that capabilities and expertise also increase correspondingly. So the third point I have here is that if we take the case of CERT, for instance, computer incident response teams, Northeast Asia tends to have, at least percentage-wise, fewer national certs compared to like Southeast Asia. Absolute number, however, does not translate to equal capability. So you can have national certs in place that are there by name, but do not necessarily have the underlying capabilities. So what we see, at least with Asia Pacific, is cybersecurity needs, capabilities, and whatnot vary across the region and even within sub-regional units. So if we dive into Southeast Asia, for instance, it would, even though, let's say, Vietnam or Cambodia would have a cert versus, let's say, Singapore would also have a cert, you cannot compare the two as being equal in terms of capability and expertise. So there's a lot of variations, a lot of inconsistencies within the region, despite the shared common interest in the importance of cybersecurity. And I trace the reason for these divergences back to the 3 points I raised earlier. So interest, threats, capability, and communication. So delving into this one at a time. So first, with a question of interest and threats. So governance priorities will at the end of the day, priorities when it comes to governance intersects primarily with the underlying interests and threats of your key decision makers. So this boils down to a question of prioritization. So certain actors, certain states would prioritize certain threats differently based on what they view as important in terms of their overall strategic goals or the sentiments of their public. So in the case of Southeast Asia, for instance, you see this wide divergence between those who focus primarily on cybersecurity threats from a criminal perspective versus those that frame it as a broader national security threat, which I would proceed to discuss in a while, using the Philippines and Singapore as an example. We also have threat perceptions varying at the level of your population. So there's more research is coming out on how socioeconomic and socio-political factors within society and even at the level of the individual would differentiate what are actually perceived as threats and how this would affect how these individuals extend influence or pressure the governments to change or manage their governance policies accordingly. So within the context of Asia, this then raises the questions of, does Asia actually view cyberspace the same way compared to other regions, and whether or not it should, or whether or not we should have a unified view of what cyberspace is and how best to address it. So in the interest of time, I'll just skip that slide. So going towards the example with Singapore and the Philippines and how we have these divergent threat perceptions leading to differences in how the governance policies are structured. In the case of Singapore, in the right, you have a more holistic society-wide view of cybersecurity threats. This was emphasized significantly back in 2019 when cybersecurity was introduced as component of their total defense framework. So in their case, cybersecurity is not only a technical threat and to a certain extent also an economic threat, but it becomes a wider societal national security issue as well by folding it into their framework. And by doing so, they managed to achieve significant buy-in across multiple sectors. Now, it's interesting to contrast this with the Philippine case. Now, although they are different developmentally, the reason why I'm using Singapore and the Philippines as an example here is because both have voiced out the significance of cybersecurity within their region. But in the case of the Philippines, what we see is that a narrower sector-specific threat representation, particularly seeing cybersecurity as more an economic threat. Although, if you look at the official policy documents, if you read or if you listen to the official statements, there is a gradual shift towards a wider framing of cybersecurity as being an issue of societal and national security. This does not really align well with the current initiatives that's being instituted. So there's still a lot more focus on the traditional picture of it being an issue of crime and law enforcement. And there's still this ongoing effort to gain broader support across different levels of society. So moving beyond threats, the other issue that we find or that we see when it comes to trying to get a common understanding of cybersecurity within the region is this issue of capabilities and maturity. I don't really need to say much when it comes to the resource aspect of this. The financials of the question would obviously, and the economic aspect of it would play a role. If you do not have the resources to build the necessary infrastructure, then obviously that does hinder it. But going beyond that, capabilities would also extend to expertise and organizational capacities. And what's interesting here is that this is also tangential to the whole question of threat perception. What you're capable of dealing with would also affect what you would perceive to be as a threat, since that would shape your prioritization of the issue. So framing something as, let's say, a national security threat would not necessarily be all that helpful if you do not have the underlying capabilities to address that particular point. Similarly, framing something for framing cybersecurity as a threat to critical infrastructure may not also be as salient if your critical infrastructure, however you define that to be, is not as dependent on cyberspace as compared to other countries in the region. So there is this whole concept of capabilities tying in with prioritization that needs to be addressed, that needs to be tackled before we even get into this whole question of how do we have a unified view of cybersecurity? How do we develop consistent norms so that we can address this issue consistently? On a broader interstate and strategic point of view, capabilities would also have implications as well when it comes to cyber operations. Although we are not espousing offensive capabilities, these would also dictate, the underlying capabilities would also dictate the extent to which cyber operations would actually be effective and the extent to which they would actually cause damage as well. So if you're not overly dependent in cyberspace, the whole notion of cyber operations moving faster and causing significant damage might not apply to you. These challenges are also reflected in the case of Singapore and the Philippines. So again, with Singapore, what we see there is a stronger economic, technological, and educational base. So in their case, they're in a much better position to develop capabilities within this space in order to form more robust governance policies and initiatives. In the case of the Philippines, however, while they are building towards this, there's noticeably greater investment and interest within government and in the private sector to develop this. There's still a great divide between capabilities along sectoral lines. So it's still not unusual that cybersecurity incidents, although legally this falls under the purview of the Justice Department in the Philippines, it's still not unusual that you'd have these institutions seeking assistance from the private sector when it comes to investigations, rather than taking on the responsibility of investigation completely by themselves. So there is this dependence that exists. Yet, despite these divergences, both still acknowledge that there is a gap when it comes to expertise for both Singapore and the Philippines. Both still recognize that they are falling short on the needed capacities here. And then finally, we have this issue of communication and cooperation, which I think is probably one of the larger issues that we have to tackle when it comes to governance concerns within the region. So when we talk about communication cooperation, we have to consider both domestic and international actors in cyberspace. So when we're talking about domestic actors, we're talking about how different organizations relevant to cybersecurity governance would cooperate or not domestically. And given the characteristics of cyberspace, we also have to bring in international cooperation here as well. So transnational incidents, you'd have to consider how part agencies from state A would cooperate from state B, and how you'd factor in that into your own governance model. And underlying this whole issue is this question of your organizational culture, whether or not these organizations are inherently set up to work effectively or are interested in actually working effectively with one another to address these issues. So what comes to mind here, and I'll mention that briefly, but I think I can mention here now, is in the context of the Philippines, for instance, there is this whole, if you look at the Philippine National Cyber Strategy, there is this imperative to cooperate with one another. So there's an imperative for the national police to work with private sector, and with private sector to work also with the Department of Defense when it comes to cybersecurity issues. But what's not mentioned there is a persistent distrust that tends to exist when it comes to private sector entities and working with national government agencies. Beyond that, and in particular with respect to the Asia Pacific, another consideration that you'd have to take when it comes to cooperation, or the lack thereof, is the unique strategic and geopolitical dynamics that occur within the region that may serve to constrain cooperation. So again, comparing and contrasting both Singapore and the Philippines in this case, in the case of Singapore, you have significant domestic and international initiatives. Most recently, the institution of the ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence highlights its willingness to both develop and cooperate with state actors, both within the region and outside the region. In contrast, and this whole cooperation mechanism within Singapore is managed by a central body, the Singapore Cybersecurity Agency. In contrast, the Philippines also has a central body that's tasked with managing it. This would be the Department of Information Communication Technology. However, these mechanisms are fairly new and to date still remain untested. So it's hard to determine whether or not cooperation can actually succeed in this case, and then factoring in the whole constraints when it comes to organizational culture also raises more questions than it answers. Now, given the divergences and issues that challenge us when it comes to developing a unified approach to managing or tackling cybersecurity, what are the possible solutions out there? An interesting approach comes from the ASEAN model. So I'm not familiar to what extent everyone is familiar with ASEAN initiatives when it comes to cyberspace, but ICT has essentially been a cornerstone when it comes to ASEAN economic development. So for the better part of 2 decades now, ASEAN has prioritized ICT development and security as a significant dimension of economic progress within the region. So for the longest time, it's been very much focused on economy. But with its acceptance of the UNGGE conventions, are the norms that the UNGGE espoused in 2015, ASEAN has since broadened its view of cybersecurity beyond this whole economy-centric view. But this is particularly problematic. First of all, because ASEAN tends to be quite skittish when it comes to dealing with complex security issues such as cybersecurity, and this comes against a lot of the limitations of the region in terms of, again, threat perception capabilities and interests of its members, as well as the underlying culture of ASEAN. So ASEAN makes its decisions by consensus, so everyone essentially has to agree on something before they move forward. But this is particularly problematic if you think about it, if everyone is coming in from different perspectives and different views with respect to cybersecurity. So it poses a particular challenge in the context of ASEAN. Now, in response to this, it has advanced a particular solution to overcome this issue, particularly leveraging this whole ASEAN minus X model, wherein we can bypass consensus at this point. Instead, you can get 2 or more like-minded members to develop initiatives on their own. So essentially, creating subgroups within the region to develop initiatives when it comes to managing and addressing cybersecurity concerns. So the benefit here is that if you have like-minded groups working together, then you overcome this whole issue of contrasting threat perceptions, cooperation issues, and capability constraints, since they are all essentially on the same playing field. And from that point, you can then start reaching out to other silos, so to speak, in order to form a consensus on how best to address the cybersecurity concerns. So this is where your confidence building measures and capacity building measures come into play. So confidence building allows us, or allows the opportunity to socialize between groups that may hold different views as to what constitutes a threat in cyberspace. At best case is that this socialization process results in a shared view of what should be prioritized when it comes to cybersecurity, what constitutes as a threat, how do we best cooperate. That's the best case scenario. Worst case, you'd at least get the understanding. So there would be less friction when it comes to states with different perspectives having to cooperate with one another down the line. Complementing this approach would be your capacity building measures. So developing the underlying expertise and organizational structure to at least get everyone to view cyberspace in the same way, or to enjoy the benefits of cyberspace such that their perspective of it would start coalescing towards a common view of the benefits and threats to cyberspace. Within the context of ASEAN, this is still a fairly new approach. It was signaled back in 2016. Interest has been ramping up in successive ASEAN meetings when it comes to dealing with cybersecurity using this approach, but we still have yet to see whether this will actually pan out, whether this will actually result in a common means of dealing with cybersecurity issues or governing cyberspace within this sub-region in the Asia Pacific. But there are a couple of caveats when it comes to this solution. First is this whole question of degree of internalization. So you might have confidence building measures, you might have capacity building measures, but the question is whether or not this will actually stick, whether or not members are simply just going through the motions to agree and to try to avoid conflict while not necessarily internalizing the process. There's also a question whether individual strategic interests amongst member states will eventually override whatever internalization has happened. And then finally, this whole notion of whether external factors will actually cause a shift or force ASEAN to change its solution. So at this point, how Southeast Asia deals with this is based on the resolutions that we've had when it comes to the UNGGE, the UN Open-Ended Working Group. But if there's a significant change in how cybersecurity is approached in these more global institutions, the question sort of remains whether ASEAN will take a different solution in dealing with the gaps or the limitations in trying to reach a consensus amongst its members when it comes to governance of cybersecurity. I keep my presentation up to that point to allow us more time with the Q&A, because I think that we'd have a lot more interesting discussions rather than just me talking longer here. So with that, I'm open to questions from the participants.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gomez, for this really interesting presentation, and especially for taking up the case studies, which I think made it very clear the challenges or the differences in governance approaches to cybersecurity. And yes, I'm also be very interested to discuss this further, and therefore open now the floor to questions. We are officially supposed, our time is until past, but I suggest that we extend maybe until 11. Well, in our time, 11:40, your time, so but so for another 15 minutes, so we have time to get at least a couple of questions in. So I'm see we've already received a couple of questions from participants who have written them down in the chat. So please, everybody, use the chat or raise your hand if you want to ask a question. I'm reading out the first question, which comes from Mr. Ho, who is asking Benji Charlier about how restrictive should we view an attack going forward pursuant to Article 49.1 of the first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions, which gives a definition of what an attack is. So it says attacks means acts of violence against the adversary, whether in offense or in defense. So Benji.
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't hear like the very beginning of the question in relation to Article 49.
Yes, so the question is, how restrictive should we view an attack going forward pursuant to Article 49.1?
That's a very good question. Like, you ask me from a humanitarian legal perspective. Okay, so the way the legal argument we believe should be articulated in relation to that question is indeed that Article 49, as you point out, defines the notion of attack. And the notion of attack is defined as an act of violence. Now, obviously, the question is, how do you interpret an act of violence? And as I mentioned, it is widely agreed that the notion of violence is not just about the actual kinetic physical mean of carrying out the act of hostility, but it also relates to the further consequences of that non-violent mean, basically, of waging war. So we believe that as such, a cyber attack is encompassed into the definition of an act of violence, and that there is no discussion for us that if this act of violence results in like physical damage, in the destruction of objects, of protected objects, or in death, injury of individuals, well, then it's definitely an attack. Now the question is, and where the interpretation of this notion is basically interesting, is that what do you make of cyber operations that the purpose of which is simply to neutralize a system as such without causing physical damage? And there you will be able to read in the position paper that I shared with you and in the articles that I shared with you, that basically we can easily make a legal argument to also include these operations into the notion of attack under international humanitarian law. Without being too technical, one of the arguments is that under the additional protocols to the Geneva Convention, the notion of a military objective, so which is the only licit target for an attack, explicitly refers to the notion of neutralization. And so it would be meaningless as a definition, a military objective, if it did not mean that attacks, the purpose of which is to neutralize those objectives, were not included in that definition. And then you can also make an additional argument based on the purpose of the law of armed conflict, which is to indeed protect civilian population from the devastating effects of the hostilities. And while a cyber attack not necessarily means like physical injuries, it can definitely critically affect the lives of the civilian population in many ways. So voilà, but I have to agree that it's a matter of interpretation at this current stage of the development of the law.
Thank you very much. So what you are also saying relates to what we had discussed earlier, the emphasis on the effect rather than on the objective or intention only. There's another question for you from Qingxuan Lui, who asks about the challenge that you mentioned of the proliferation of cyber tools. And the question is whether you think that states have the obligation to prevent the leakage and usage of cyber tools that they develop. So leakage and then usage by rogue actors, I assume. For example, Eternal Blue, which is a cyber attack exploit developed by the US National Security Agency and which has caused huge damages.
Okay, so I believe that it's also a question that could be very relevant for Miguel. Because, okay, I can make a point about the obligations of states in relation to a situation of armed conflict specifically, but more globally about the risks of the proliferation of the cyber operations by state and non-state armed groups. I mean, it's definitely a matter of concern for cybersecurity experts in general. In relation to armed conflicts, so there is, let me just think how to make that point as straightforward and clear as possible. So there's possibly two angles. There is an obligation for states to test the adequacy of new weapons that they intend to develop or use with the law of armed conflict before using them. So there is a rule under Additional Protocol 1 that basically obliges states, when they develop any type of weapon, and this includes cyber weapons, to actually make sure that the way these weapons are designed will allow them to use these weapons in accordance with the law of war. And the law of war, basically, the conduct of hostilities is based on 3 pillars, the principle of distinction that I said. So you cannot develop a weapon which by definition will be indiscriminate and that you will not be able to control, that will target civilian and military objectives alike. There is the principle of proportionality, under which you cannot develop a weapon which you know, when you will be using it, that it will create excessive collateral damages to the civilian population. And then there's the principle of precaution, which basically obliges belligerent parties to take all the possible precautions to limit the effect of these weapons. And again, this includes cyber weapons, the effects on the civilian population. So, voila, when you use a cyber weapon, you are bound unconditionally. There is no exception. You cannot waive these obligations to abide by the principle of distinction, precaution, and what did I say? Proportionality. And there is a legal obligation to test your weapons in relation to these 3 principles somehow. So, indeed, I mean, at the end of the day, then it's up to the states to see how much they can invest into testing these weapons. But our recommendation is basically that states test these weapons in I don't know, in simulations somehow to make sure that they can contain those weapons. That once they're being used, well, they can be somehow deactivated so that the blueprint is not being left out there in the wild for other actors to reuse it and repurpose it. and to making sure that whatever weapons they design can actually be directed at a legitimate military objective.
Just to add to that, so there are two things that we'd have to consider here. So ISHL is pretty clear on the need to adhere to these requirements, but it's one thing to say that we're doing, or a state is doing its best efforts to address this whole the requirements of proportionality, distinction, etc. And it's another thing to guarantee that that can actually happen in real life, given the complex nature and unpredictability of the domain. So a good example that's frequently used here is the case of Stuxnet. So despite all the investment that the United States went about, and the general caution and risk aversion that the United States has when it comes to planning operations, cyber or otherwise, we still saw cases wherein the malware leaked beyond its intended target. Thankfully, no significant damage came about as a result. But the fact remains that it is, from a practice standpoint, it's incredibly difficult to guarantee that a cyber operation or cyber weapon will actually hit just its intended target. And this has been used by a number of researchers in the last 5 years, I'd say, to justify why we actually see a lot more restraint when it comes to using these weapons within the international system. Now, the flip side to this coin, to this question is it, and this was not asked by the participant, but the other way to ask this is, would it be interesting, or is it actually useful for a state to leak the cyber operation of a rival adversary? Would that actually improve overall cybersecurity? And also the answer there is quite mixed. And we did see that in action during the Trump administration, when US Cyber Command uploaded to VirusTotal code that, if I'm not mistaken, it was a Russian cyber operation that was used to render further additional operations ineffective moving forward. So it's a very tricky situation here when it comes to whether or not it should be used, or these tools should be used, and whether or not states could actually adhere to the legal requirements of using these tools.
Just one point, I very much agree, and thank you very much for making that point. As I think it illustrates extremely well the extreme relevance of actually looking into these issues. Because on the one hand, there is no doubt that cyber capabilities are extremely efficient and can be extremely, like from a military perspective, you mentioned Stuxnet. I mean, there's no doubt that states will have recourse to those capabilities in the future. But then the question of how these operations are contained by the law is absolutely crucial, because otherwise you open a Pandora's box. And the question is, indeed, how do you reconcile the reality of the complexity of these operations and their value with the necessity to actually, I mean, the discussions were the same when we talked about also, you know, other means of warfare, like when drones were used at first. I mean, the same questions, like how does the law apply to these new means, etc. But at the end of the day, it's a matter of making sure that you do not open a Pandora's box and believe that some cyber operations or other means happen in a legal vacuum and are not actually limited as other weapons are. But it's very complicated and complex indeed.
Thank you. No, there's another question for Mr. Gomez from Tom Yoshizaki, who asked relating to your part discussing ASEAN's contribution to cybersecurity, and he's asking, how should we deal with the caveats that you mentioned in the ASEAN approach? Do you think capacity building projects, for example, by East Asian countries, will enhance cyber resilience of ASEAN members, or will it fuel the rivalry among them?
All right, so I'll answer first on the capacity building question, since that's the easier one to, well, relatively easier one to answer. So a lot of the capacity building measures right now within ASEAN focuses more on is more on the defensive nature. So incident response, training, and education. A lot of it's being spearheaded by Singapore, as well as by Japan, as part of their ongoing collaboration with the region. Now, will this actually lead to resilience? That is the goal of these initiatives. So by building these capacities and skill sets, they should lead to more resilience. But will this lead to greater conflict within the region? This then links to the other issue that we face with cybersecurity, in that this whole dual use question. Defensive skills that you would learn in cybersecurity can also contribute to offensive capabilities. Now, whether or not this would lead to greater rivalry amongst them is an open question. At least on the surface, on the face of it, the statements that we've received from the from ASEAN, particularly from the ADMM, the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, is that their interest in cyberspace is to promote stability within the region. So take from that what you may. That does not preclude the possibility that because of the attribution issue that we still face in cyber, that other states may still use it to advance their capabilities. But that's something that we cannot say immediately will occur. So that's one of those crystal ball moments that I cannot say that that's exactly what's going to happen. I cannot rule it out as a possibility, but at least the official line right now is to minimize potential rivalry within the region, which has always been one of the driving forces behind ASEAN. Now, as to whether or not how to deal with the caveats within ASEAN, that is a harder question to answer for two reasons. Firstly, is a lot of the caveats that we face is linked primarily with how ASEAN was institutionalized. So the two things that we find most problematic, not only when it comes to cybersecurity issues, but with other security issues in ASEAN, is that it emphasizes the sovereignty of its members and this whole notion of reaching agreement by consensus. So unless there's a major restructuring within how ASEAN works, which is highly unlikely, these caveats are something that we just have to live with. So that's one half of the question. The other issue is the external forces that may shape how ASEAN responds. So one of the underlying goals behind the institution of ASEAN was try to distance the region away from major power politics. But unfortunately, that would also mean that that would also limit your choices as a situation develops. So it's actually hard to say how things would go at this point. So ultimately, how ASEAN behaves will be influenced by what happens outside the regions with its major partners in that space. So if there's a significant shift there, then I foresee that ASEAN will simply just try to do its best to deal with it. And whether or not that would actually hinder its approach to reaching or addressing cybersecurity governance within the region, it's hard to say. Depends really on how the situation shifts.
Thank you. So you're basically not seeing ASEAN as leading on cyber, but rather as following.
The way it seems right now is exactly that. So we saw this at work in the 2016 ADMM Plus meeting, and then most recently the ASEAN ministerial meeting on cybersecurity in 2018 also reconfirmed the norm. So it seems that ASEAN is more towards the leading aspect when it comes to following aspect. Sorry, when it comes to cybersecurity, rather than explicitly leading changes. That's not to say that whatever policies or initiatives it institutes is not adopted by other regions. So I think there's nothing in ASEAN, or at least within its member states, that are not happy if other regions would adopt its approach.
And I think it will be an interesting discussion then to have to see what kind of ASEAN develops, what other regions can learn from that. That would also be very interesting. But that's
Definitely.
I think a discussion for another time. If there are no more urgent questions now, I would then like to close this session and also close the day. And thank all of the speakers once again. I think we did a very, very, very intense and very broad round of many different issues regarding cybersecurity, governance, international and national. We looked very closely into issues of conflict and use of cyber capabilities and armed conflict, both as in the issue of what constitutes a cyber conflict, or when do you these discussions around and which have not been resolved yet, and into how to apply UN Charter to the use of cyber means, which have been discussed, and but as the speakers showed very well, there's still quite a number of open questions, as well as similar the application of international humanitarian law also in conflicts where cyber means are used, where again there's a need really for countries to pronounce themselves more, or for more clarity on how the application should really look like. So I think we are living in very interesting times in the development of international law in this context, and a lot of developments, both driven by the UN, but also by private actors, like the Digital Geneva Convention initiative by Microsoft, which are worth following in that context. And I'm also very happy that we managed to cover the national aspects of cybersecurity governance, and had a very good case study of the Japanese CERT and what the importance of a CERT in the national context, how it works and supports its constituents, whether the private sector or public, and the challenges that it and opportunities that it has in cooperating with different actors nationally, but also with like-minded certs from the region. And it is on the one hand very encouraging to see that this cert cooperation, which we have also witnessed in the Europe region, where we worked amongst the technical staff, tries to avoid really political and discussions and focuses on the need of keeping the network up, but of course this is still political issues are somehow always in the back of the mind, but it really shows the importance of trust building in this area as well. And then finally, these two case studies of Philippines and Singapore, around which Mr. Gomez structured his presentation, showed us also very well about how, on the one hand, when you have the cooperation within communication amongst cybersecurity actors within a country, is obviously influenced by the situation, the economic and cultural situation in a country, whether there's willingness or a previous experience in cooperation, but also as he showed very well, there's also maybe a role of the policymaker in setting the priority of cybersecurity, and see it in really through national strategies, rather key documents show, really pronouncing themselves and setting clear structures that show that everybody in society can and should contribute to cybersecurity, and then hopefully finding good tools of realizing that. So thanks to have all of you, especially for all of your great questions and contributions to the discussion. And I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. And a big thank you to our speakers, and please join me in applauding them for their great contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.